My daughter said, "We had the engagement dinner yesterday. Who wants an old cripple like you at the luxury party?" We had the engagement dinner yesterday. Who wants an old cripple like you at the luxury party? The words sliced through the air before I even crossed the threshold. My daughter Evelyn stood at the center of the room, a champagne flute in one hand, her voice carrying above the low hum of conversation. Every head turned toward me. I was still in the doorway, leaning on my crutches, the winter wind clinging to my coat. I had come to bring her a gift, something precious, something that had belonged to her father. The small, velvet box felt warm in my palm, despite the cold outside. Its contents polished the night before until they gleamed. It was the pocket watch my late husband had carried every day of our marriage, the same watch he had checked the moment he left work, hurrying home to us. I had imagined her opening it with softened eyes, maybe even thanking me. That hope had kept me going through the long, aching bus ride and the climb up her wide stone steps. But now, under the bright light of her home and the sharper light of her words, that hope felt foolish. I stepped forward slowly, my right leg dragging slightly behind, the rubber tip of my left crutch clicking against the floor. The scent of expensive perfume and champagne hit me, so different from the smell of firewood that lingered in my own home. Evelyn's friends, draped in glittering dresses and sharp suits, watched me as though I were an unwelcome gust of cold air. I held out the box. "I came to give you something," I said quietly. Her manicured hand swept it from mine in a single motion. The box hit the polished floor with a dull thud, popped open, and the watch tumbled out, rolling across the rug until it hit the tile with a metallic clink. A few people gasped softly, but no one moved to pick it up. Before I could take a step toward it, Evelyn's pointed heel nudged the side of my crutch, hard enough to jar my balance. My knee buckled, my other crutch scraping the floor to keep me upright. Laughter rippled through the room. "Careful," she said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "We wouldn't want you to fall and make a scene." Someone near the fireplace began limping in an exaggerated fashion, dragging one foot as they leaned on an invisible cane. A woman in a red dress covered her mouth to stifle a laugh, her eyes shining with mockery. Another guest raised his glass in a mock toast toward me. Brad, Evelyn's fiancé, bent to pick up the watch. He turned it over in his palm. "Antique," he said, his tone dripping with feigned interest. "Probably worth more melted down than kept like this." He tossed it onto a side table without looking at me. I felt the weight of every gaze in the room. The music still played softly from the speakers, but all I could hear was the thud of my heart and the faint ticking of the watch. I bent to retrieve it, my back aching, my crutch pressing into my ribs. When I straightened, I met Evelyn's eyes. She held my gaze with a cold satisfaction, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. I placed the watch back in its box and closed the lid gently. Without another word, I turned toward the door. The crowd parted just enough for me to pass, forcing me to navigate between sequined skirts and polished shoes. The door shut behind me, muting the laughter and the clink of glasses. The winter air hit me like a slap, sharp and clean. I tightened my grip on the box, the metal inside still warm from my hand. By the time I reached the bottom of the steps, I knew I would never forget that scene. And I knew something else, too. Something that Evelyn and her glittering friends could never have guessed. I was not always the woman who moved slowly, leaning on crutches. Once, my stride was sure, my back straight, my hands free to carry whatever life handed me. That changed on an afternoon when Evelyn was just 17, the day I gave her the rest of my body in exchange for her life. It was late autumn, the air sharp with the smell of burning leaves. We had been arguing about something small, whether she could borrow my car to go to a party, when the light turned red at the busy intersection by Miller's Hardware. I remember the way she yanked open the passenger door, stepping into the street before I had fully stopped. That was when the truck came, a delivery vehicle barreling down the hill, its horn blaring, the driver's face frozen in panic. Evelyn was still in its path, frozen herself, the box of cupcakes she'd been holding tumbling to the pavement. I do not remember thinking, only moving. My hands shoved her backward with every ounce of strength I had, and the next instant the world was a blur of metal and sound. The impact spun me to the ground, my back striking the curb with a crack that made the edges of my vision go white. When I opened my eyes, Evelyn was kneeling beside me, sobbing, her fingers gripping my coat. "I'll take care of you forever, Mom," she kept saying between gasps. "I promise. I'll never leave you." Her tears fell hot on my cheek as the sirens grew louder. The surgeons told me later that my spine had been damaged in a way they could not fully repair. I would walk again, but never without support. The crutches became my new shadow, my constant companion. For a while, Evelyn did mean it. She fetched things for me, slowed her pace so I could keep up, even learned how to adjust the grips on my crutches. But compassion can wither in certain climates, and over time, something in her eyes changed. By the time she left for college, the tenderness had cooled into something else, something sharper. At family gatherings, when the story of the accident came up, she would shift in her seat, her lips tightening. Then, little by little, she began to tell it differently. "She stepped into the street without looking," I heard her say once at my sister's barbecue, her voice pitched just loud enough for the cluster of cousins to hear. "She's been playing the martyr ever since. If she wants to hobble around for sympathy, that's her choice." The first time I heard it, I told myself she was just embarrassed by the story, trying to make light of it, but she told it again and again. Each version leaned harder into the idea that I had somehow brought it on myself. "She acts like I owe her for the rest of my life," she told her aunt over coffee one Thanksgiving, "always hinting that I should pay for this or that because of what happened. I'm not her caretaker. She made her own choices." Her words spread, and soon the way people looked at me began to change. Where there had once been respect or pity, there was now a hint of skepticism, as if they were wondering whether I had staged my own misfortune for the sake of control. What they never knew was what came next. The year Evelyn graduated high school, she was accepted into an expensive private university 3 states away. The tuition was more than my yearly salary, even before the medical bills. I sold our family home, the one my husband and I had bought when Evelyn was born, with the swing set still in the backyard, to pay her tuition in full for the first 2 years. I told her it was her father's dream to see her walk across that stage in cap and gown, and I would not let money stand in the way. She thanked me at the time, though not effusively. She hugged me, smiled for a few photos, and then left with her friends to celebrate. I stayed in a rented apartment, half the size of our old living room, the walls bare except for the photos I could not bring myself to box up. By the time she graduated, the story had shifted again. "I never got my inheritance," she told her fiancé's parents over dinner one night, not knowing I was within earshot. "She sold the house out from under me, kept the money for herself." It was the opposite of the truth, but the truth no longer seemed to matter. What mattered was the image she curated, the self-made woman unburdened by a needy mother. There were other slights, smaller but just as cutting, invitations that never arrived, phone calls unanswered for weeks. The Christmas she sent me a scented candle with the wick already burned once, as if it had been regifted. When I asked about it, she laughed. "You're so picky, Mom. You should be grateful you get anything." The promise she had made as a sobbing teenager, "I'll take care of you forever," had long since curdled into something unrecognizable. It was around then that I began to notice a different pattern. Evelyn could be cruel to me in ways she would never be to strangers, but if someone else did something similar, she would find a way to praise them. When her fiancé Brad's mother broke her hip and needed a live-in nurse, Evelyn posted about it on social media, praising Brad for his devotion and sacrifice because he visited once a week. "He's such a good son," she would tell people. Meanwhile, the years I spent working double shifts at the diner to pay off my medical debt and her tuition were invisible, erased in favor of a story where I was the burden she had to escape. It was a double standard so glaring it might have been funny if it had not been my life. The night after the engagement dinner, the one I had not been invited to, was the first time I let myself sit with the truth. Whatever bond I had once believed unbreakable had already been broken. Evelyn had not just rewritten our history. She had sold the rights to the highest bidder in her social circle, and the currency was my dignity. I did not yet know what I would do about it, but I knew for the first time that doing nothing was no longer an option. Brad was the kind of man who could make a bad decision sound like an adventure. A few years ago, he poured nearly every cent he had, and a good deal of money he did not, into some half-baked investment scheme involving luxury modular homes that were supposed to be the next big thing. The company folded in under a year. Contractors went unpaid, buyers sued, and Brad filed for bankruptcy before the dust had even settled. You would think that kind of failure might at least humble a man, but not Brad. Within weeks, he was back on social media, posting grainy photos of himself in business meetings, captioned with things like, "Real men bounce back, and failure is just the tuition for success." Evelyn ate it up. "He's the most resilient man I've ever met," she told her friends, her voice warm with admiration. "He's been through so much and come out stronger. That's the kind of grit you can't buy." Meanwhile, my grit was invisible. My decades of scraping by, of making do with less, of never missing a rent payment even when it meant skipping meals, none of that counted, not in Evelyn's world. I remember the day she came to my cabin, all perfume and polished nails, to ask for $5,000, 0 cents. She did not sit down, just stood in the middle of the room as if she were afraid of catching the scent of wood smoke that lingered in the air. "It's just a temporary loan," she said, like it was a foregone conclusion. "Brad and I need to cover some wedding expenses until the next payout from his consulting job." I knew what consulting job meant. It meant Brad had convinced someone else to give him money for advice he wasn't qualified to give. It meant there would be no payout, not one that would arrive in time to repay me. "I can't do that," I said. "I don't lend money I know I won't get back." Her eyes narrowed just slightly, but the softness in her voice dropped away like a mask slipping. "So you'd rather watch your only daughter struggle?" "I'd rather not be in a position where I have to choose between paying my bills and funding your lifestyle," I said. She left in silence, her heels snapping against the floor, but I knew the silence would not last. By the end of the week, the phone calls began. Not to me, but about me. Cousins called to ask why I was being so cold. An old neighbor left me a voicemail that began, "I'm sure there's more to the story, but..." And then I heard the words Evelyn had been planting in their ears. "She's living all alone in that rotting shack. One of these days she's going to freeze to death out there. Honestly, the sooner the better, at least then she won't be anyone's problem." The first time I heard it, I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so grotesque, I thought no one could believe it. But people did. They believed her because it was easier than asking me, because Evelyn's voice, sharp with conviction, left no space for doubt. It was not just the words. It was the way she contrasted me with Brad. To her circle, Brad was a man of courage, a phoenix rising from the ashes of his own mistakes. I was just an old cripple, clinging to my pennies in a drafty cabin. I started noticing the shift in how others treated me. At the grocery store, a woman I'd known for 20 years avoided eye contact in the produce aisle. At church, someone I'd once considered a friend offered me a bag of canned goods, pressing it into my hands with the kind of pity you reserve for stray animals. The truth that I had enough, that I was comfortable in my small, simple life, no longer mattered. The narrative Evelyn had spun was easier to believe, that I was bitter, selfish, and waiting to die in my rotting shack. The double standard burned worst at family gatherings. One summer barbecue, Brad regaled the table with the story of how he had once convinced a bank to forgive part of his debt. He described it like a war hero might describe surviving the front lines. Everyone nodded, impressed. Evelyn reached over and squeezed his hand, her voice dripping with pride. "See, Mom? That's what it means to fight back." I wanted to tell her that fighting back sometimes looks less like smooth talk and more like swallowing your pride while scrubbing motel bathrooms because it's the only work you can find. But I had learned that in this family, the kind of struggle that counts is the kind you can dress up in a suit and post online. In quieter moments, I found myself replaying her words about my rotting shack, about how it would be better if I froze to death. I thought of the years I had cut my own food into smaller portions so she could have more. The winters I had patched her coats instead of buying a new one for myself. The nights I stayed awake, listening for her to come home safe. But Evelyn had rewritten those sacrifices into something ugly, something she could use to elevate herself. It was in those moments, sitting in my small cabin with the fire crackling and the wind pressing against the windows, that I began to think not just about the past, but about what came next. Because the truth was, I was not helpless. I had resources Evelyn did not know about, and I had patience, a patience she mistook for weakness. And if she thought the story ended with me shivering in the dark, She was about to find out just how wrong she was. The storm had been building all day, the wind dragging loose snow across the fields and piling it against the sides of my cabin. By nightfall, the drifts were so high they swallowed the bottom half of my kitchen window. The lights flickered once, twice, and then the power went out for good. I stood in the middle of the living room, listening to the silence that follows a sudden blackout. The stove had gone cold hours earlier, the pilot light refusing to catch despite my best efforts. I still had my wool blankets, but the temperature was dropping fast enough that I could see my breath in the lamplight. I told myself I could manage. I had seen worse winters, but my joints ached from the cold, and every movement felt slower, heavier. When I reached for the kettle, my fingers barely closed around the handle. It was then I realized I had to choose between my pride and my survival. So I picked up the phone and dialed Evelyn. It rang long enough that I almost hung up, but then her voice came through, sharp and bright, like she'd just stepped away from a crowd. "Mom, this better be important." "Evelyn?" My voice cracked more than I wanted it to. "It's freezing here. The power's out, the stove's gone cold. I don't think I can last the night without heat. Could you come get me? Or send Brad?" There was a pause, the faint clink of glass in the background. Then, without muting herself, she said to someone else, "Hold on, you've got to hear this." The next thing I knew, her voice was booming through a speaker. "Hey everyone, listen up, old Cripple's doing her frozen-in-the-woods drama again." The room on her end erupted in laughter, muffled but unmistakable. Someone, male, maybe Brad, said, "Put her on speaker. Let's hear the performance." My stomach turned. "Evelyn, this isn't a joke. I'm telling you, it's—" Another voice cut me off, a woman's this time, dripping with mockery. "Aw, poor frosty grandma, somebody get her a snow globe so she can pretend she's in Florida." Then came a louder, crueler laugh from a man I didn't recognize. "Nah, let her freeze. We can live stream it, set up a GoFundMe. Call it Send Mother Off in Style. Bet we'd raise a fortune." There was the distinct sound of champagne glasses clinking together, followed by Evelyn's voice, full of false sweetness. "Cheers to that." And then, click. The line went dead. For a moment I just stood there with the phone still in my hand, listening to the empty hum. The fireless stove loomed in the corner, and the only sound now was my own heartbeat in my ears, steady and loud, as if reminding me to keep moving before the cold claimed me. I set the phone down on the counter and wrapped another blanket around my shoulders, tucking it under my chin. My body was shaking now, whether from the cold or from the humiliation, I could not tell. I had been mocked before, at family gatherings, in quiet, snide comments. But this was different. This was a public display, a deliberate stripping of dignity in front of an audience she had chosen. I thought about the people on the other end of that call, their laughter mingling with the clink of crystal glasses. They had not seen the night years ago when I stepped into the road without thinking, shoving Evelyn out of the way of an oncoming truck. They had not seen me in the hospital bed, learning that the damage to my spine would never heal. They had not seen the nights I sat in the dark, afraid to turn on the heat because the bill had to wait until her tuition was paid. To them, I was just a character in a story Evelyn told, a story where I was inconvenient, bitter, and best kept at a distance. The temperature kept dropping. My breath fogged the air in front of me, and my fingers went numb even inside the blanket. I moved slowly to the cabinet where I kept the emergency candles, lighting one after another until the small flames dotted the room. Their light was warm, but their heat was nothing against the icy air creeping in through the cracks. I lasted through the night by sheer will, keeping myself moving enough to stay awake. The storm finally broke in the early morning hours, the wind dying down until there was only silence outside. When the sun rose, I saw the world outside covered in glittering drifts, the kind of beauty that can kill you if you're not careful. I stoked the stove until the flames finally caught, the first real warmth in nearly 12 hours. As the heat spread slowly through the cabin, I sat down with a cup of tea and thought about the phone call, not just the cruelty of it, but the carelessness. Evelyn had never considered that one day her words might matter to someone other than the people she meant to impress. She thought I would carry that humiliation in silence. And for the moment, she was right. But silence is not the same as surrender, and I had a long memory. That night, the ticking of the old wall clock seemed louder than usual, each second matching the slow, deliberate thud of my heart. My crutches clicked softly on the wooden floor as I moved toward the cedar wardrobe, the sound echoing in the stillness. The coat was buried in the back under a pile of blankets, but as I dug deeper, my fingers brushed against something stiff, like thick cardboard wrapped in cloth. I pulled it out and realized it was my late husband's old leather portfolio, the one he used to keep his music notes in when he was still alive. The leather was worn and cracked, and the brass latch gave way with a reluctant snap. Inside, I found dozens of yellowed sheets, each covered in his careful, looping handwriting and neat musical notation. My breath caught when I recognized the titles. Folk ballads he had been working on for years. Melodies he used to hum under his breath while sanding wood in his workshop. He had always planned to publish them when the time was right. But the accident that took his health and later his life stole that chance. At the very bottom of the stack was a thick envelope, its edges curling. I opened it to find a formal copyright registration from decades ago, signed and sealed by the federal office. Every song, every verse, every line of music, all legally registered to his name, and now, by inheritance, mine. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers over the embossed seal. I had almost forgotten these existed. Back then, when my husband first tucked these songs away, I never thought they were anything more than personal keepsakes. A piece of him I could hold on to when the house felt too quiet. I had no idea that the folk music scene had shifted, that collectors and record labels were now willing to pay a fortune for authentic, untouched material from that era. I thought about Evelyn's words at the dinner table, about Brad's smug grin, about the way they had all laughed when I begged for warmth during the storm. I wondered what they would say if they knew the very thing they had mocked me for, my rotting shack life, had been hiding something worth more than their entire house. The next morning, I called one of my husband's old friends, Martin, who had been part of a small music collective with him back in the 70s. It had been years since we spoke, but the warmth in his voice was instant when he recognized me. I told him what I'd found, and after a long pause, he said, "You have no idea what you're sitting on, do you?" Martin explained that there was a new wave of young artists, digging deep into authentic American folk music, desperate for material that was both genuine and untouched by the market. One singer in particular, a rising star with a massive following, had been looking for exactly the kind of songs my husband wrote. She wanted exclusive rights, and she had a label willing to pay handsomely to secure them. I emailed Martin scans of the copyrights and sample recordings I still had on cassette tapes. Within 2 days, he called back with news that made my knees weaken. "They're offering $3.5 million," he said, his voice somewhere between disbelief and joy. "For full rights, exclusive license. They want to release the album this year. $3.5 million. The number echoed in my head as if the cabin itself had whispered it. I thought about the heating bills, the leaking roof, the cheap canned soup I had eaten through last winter, and then I thought about Evelyn, about the way she had looked at me with that thin smile as she kicked my crutch out from under me. "I'll sign," I told Martin, "but I want it quiet. No press, no leaks. No one finds out, especially not my daughter." "Understood," he said. "We can arrange the transfer discreetly." When the contract arrived by courier, I signed with steady hands. The money went into a private trust, under a name no one in my family would recognize. By the time the ink dried, I was no longer a woman begging for heat in a storm. I was a woman holding a key, and I intended to turn it when it would hurt the most. The agreement had been finalized within a week, though the actual transfer of funds took another month, as the lawyers verified every copyright and contract. It was meticulous, but in the end, every cent arrived safely into the trust I controlled. I had $3.5 million sitting in an account with a name that even Evelyn's most determined snooping could never connect to me. Money is power, yes, but power is worthless unless you know where to aim it. And I had spent a lifetime watching my daughter and her circle, learning exactly where they were vulnerable. Her wedding was their crown jewel. Every conversation for the past 6 months had revolved around the event of the year, from the imported orchids to the 12-piece jazz band to the champagne fountain in the foyer. The venue alone, an exclusive estate just outside the city, was booked through a high-end event management company that prided itself on curating unforgettable experiences for society's elite. Through a law firm that specialized in anonymity, I set up a shell corporation with a generic name, Northwood Holdings. Within 2 weeks, Northwood quietly acquired controlling shares of that event management company. The transaction was clean, quiet, and absolutely invisible to anyone not digging deep into private business records. I made sure of that. But ownership alone wasn't enough. I wanted the strike to be surgical, personal. That's when the opportunity fell into my lap in the form of a phone call from a young man named Caleb. He was a part-time waiter at the engagement dinner Evelyn had so proudly posted about online. He had been there the night she put me on speakerphone for the whole table, the night they laughed and clinked glasses at the idea of me freezing to death. I recorded it, he said bluntly when I asked how he'd gotten my number. I'm not proud of eavesdropping, but, well, I've got a grandmother, and if I ever heard someone talk to her like that, I'd lose my job punching them. He offered to give me the recording, saying it was the least he could do after witnessing something so cruel. Evelyn's voice crystal clear, mocking me, her friends laughing, one of them saying they should live-stream the old hag's funeral. He explained he had recognized my name on the seating chart at the engagement dinner and tracked me down through a contact at the hotel cafe where he also worked part-time. When I heard what she said, well, I figured you might want the truth on your side. I didn't hesitate. I bought the recording, then had my lawyer ensure it was transcribed, time-stamped, and preserved with a legal certification that it came from a credible source. I knew exactly how to use it. 5 days before the wedding, under my direction, the event company sent a formal letter to Evelyn and Brad. It was worded with the kind of corporate politeness that stings more than an insult. Due to documented behavior during a prior engagement dinner, which included verbal abuse and derogatory remarks directed at our contracted staff, our management has determined that continuing to host your event would be in violation of our Code of Conduct and Employee Protection Policy. As such, we are terminating the contract effective immediately. As per the signed agreement, deposits are non-refundable. I imagined Evelyn's perfectly manicured hands gripping the letter, her eyes darting over the legal jargon, before she reached the one line she would understand, without a lawyer. No refund. Tens of thousands of dollars, gone in an instant, and no other venue available on such short notice. I didn't need to see her reaction to know what came next. She would scream at Brad. Brad would blame her. The perfect fairy tale they'd built for Instagram would begin to rot from the inside, 5 days before the whole world was supposed to see it. And this was only the first cut. The headline hit the local news site before breakfast. Bride loses wedding venue after verbally abusing event staff. It was accompanied by a flattering headshot of Evelyn, one she had probably paid a photographer handsomely to take, now sitting beside a story that made her look like the villain in her own fairy tale. The article quoted the event company's statement in full, including the part about verbal abuse and derogatory remarks. They didn't need to mention my name. Anyone who had been at that dinner already knew. By noon, the story had spread to social media. Strangers were commenting on her Instagram posts with champagne glass emojis and captions like, "Cheers to karma." Neighbors who had once envied her lifestyle now whispered at the grocery store checkout line. The wedding hashtag she'd printed on her invitations was being used to post memes about her classless meltdown. 3 days later, a knock echoed through my cabin. The sound was hesitant, almost apologetic, but when I opened the door, Evelyn swept inside without waiting for an invitation. Her designer coat still smelled faintly of perfume, but her eyes were red-rimmed. "Mom," she started, her voice breaking in that deliberate way she used when she wanted pity. I need your help. We can fix this. If you lend me the money, I'll—" I didn't let her finish. I reached for my phone on the table, tapped the screen, and the familiar hiss of background noise filled the room. Then came her voice, sharp, mocking, from that engagement dinner. "Who wants an old cripple like you at a luxury party?" Laughter followed, and another voice chimed in about live streaming my funeral. The color drained from her face. I set the phone down gently and met her eyes. My voice was steady, almost quiet. "The night you chose to turn my pain into your party trick, you ended whatever we had left." She opened her mouth as if to argue, but whatever she saw in my expression made her think better of it. She left without another word, her heels clicking against the wooden floor until the door closed behind her. I thought that would be enough, but the truth is, Evelyn had never learned the difference between humiliation and consequence. And Brad, well, Brad was about to learn it the hard way. Through one of my shell companies, I reached out to a business contact who owed me a favor, an acquisitions manager for a Fortune 500 firm that had been negotiating a multi-million-dollar deal with Brad's investment company. All it took was a discreet email, attaching a few high-resolution photos from the engagement dinner, Brad laughing over a champagne flute while Evelyn mocked me on speakerphone, surrounded by friends who looked like they'd stepped out of a lifestyle magazine. I paired the images with a few carefully chosen rumors I'd coaxed out of one of Brad's former colleagues, whispers about questionable accounting practices, and a client whose funds had mysteriously evaporated after Brad's investment strategy went sideways. The deal collapsed within days. The loss gutted Brad's company, triggering a cascade of cancellations from other clients who didn't want their money tied to a public scandal. Over the next 6 weeks, the firm bled clients and investors, each departure triggering another, until the company was little more than an empty office with unpaid bills. Evelyn's dream wedding was already dead. Now her husband-to-be's career was gasping for air right beside it. I didn't pop champagne. I didn't celebrate. I just sat by my window, watching the snow melt off the pines, and thought about how some debts take years to come due. But when they do, they pay with interest. 6 months after the scandal broke, the inevitable happened. The glossy wedding photos Evelyn had once plastered all over her social media were gone, replaced by long stretches of silence. Word filtered back through the same cousins who used to relay her insults. The marriage had ended quietly, without so much as an official announcement. The divorce papers were signed in a courthouse, with no guests, no witnesses beyond the clerks and lawyers. Brad had taken what little was left of his reputation and fled to another state. Evelyn stayed, but the town didn't forget. Restaurants and event venues began adding her name to their "do not serve" lists after one too many public outbursts, each time captured on a smartphone and shared in the local Facebook groups. Service staff talked, and word traveled fast. Soon she couldn't book a table at a mid-tier bistro, let alone host another lavish party. Her circle of friends thinned to nothing. Local Facebook groups began sharing a compilation of videos. Evelyn yelling at a caterer, mocking a waitress's accent, and storming out of a boutique without paying. By then, I had turned my attention to something that mattered. With a portion of the royalties from my late husband's music, I established the Daniel Hayes Music Fellowship, a scholarship for young musicians who had been dismissed, overlooked, or told they weren't worth the investment. The fund paid for instruments, studio time, and professional mentorship, giving voices that might have been silenced a chance to be heard. On the day of the fellowship's opening ceremony, the hall was filled with hopeful faces, teenagers clutching guitars, young women with violins, a boy holding a battered trumpet like it was gold. Years of therapy had traded my crutches for a sturdy cane, though the limp remained. I walked to the podium, my cane tapping softly against the hardwood floor, and spoke about my husband's love for music, how he believed no song was too small to matter. Afterward, I prepared one last gift. I placed a plain white envelope in the outgoing mail, addressed to Evelyn in her neat, slanted handwriting. Inside was a small USB drive and a single card. The drive contained a digitized recording of my husband singing an old folk ballad he had written for me decades ago, "The Mother Who Was Not Left Behind." His voice, deep and warm, carried the kind of truth no amount of money could buy. On the card, I wrote only 8 words, "For those who know how to keep promises." I never called to see if she listened. Some doors, once closed, are meant to stay that way. That evening, I returned to my new home, a modest place by the water, where the salt air drifted through the open windows. The sun was setting, casting gold across the waves. I sat on the wide porch with a cup of tea, the old wooden cane resting against my chair. From the speaker beside me, my husband's voice filled the air, singing the song he had written so long ago. I tapped the end of my cane gently in time with the music, each beat steady, certain. The sky darkened to violet, and the last light of the day lingered on the horizon. I had been called many things in my life, cripple, miser, drama queen, but in that moment, with the music and the sea and the memory of a promise kept, I knew exactly who I was, and I knew that I had never, not once, been left behind. And that, my dear listeners, is how a daughter's cruelty became the spark for my greatest victory. Life has a way of circling back, sometimes with a whisper, sometimes with a thunderclap, and when it does, those who underestimated you will hear it loudest. If my story stirred something in you, if it reminded you that dignity, patience, and a sharp mind can outlast any insult, then you already understand the truth. Revenge is sweetest when served with silence and a steady hand. I have more stories to share, some tender, some fiery, all of them true. So pull up a chair, pour yourself a cup of tea, and hit that subscribe button to Grandma True Stories, because we're only just getting started, and you won't want to miss what comes next.